Well, good evening and welcome to the gallery, the Art Gallery at Gabbert's, and to a symposium sponsored, co-sponsored with Gabbert's and the American Society of Classical Realism, which has put on this show that you see about you here. We're going to be talking tonight about classical realism on the cutting edge of postmodern art. The members of the panel before you, there's myself, I'll be the moderator. My name is Gary Christensen. I'm also the president and co-founder of the American Society of Classical Realism. I work professionally as a commercial artist and have been taking lessons at the Atelier Lesueur School, studio school, for the past 2.5 years part-time. And that's how I got introduced to the art form and got involved. This evening on my immediate left is Lisa Borman. And Lisa is a graduate of Atelier LAC. She graduated in 1983 and has been an instructor at Atelier Lesueur for the past 6 years. And she's been working as a professional award-winning artist and is nationally known as well for the past 6 years. Next to her is Richard Lack, founder of Atelier LAC in 1969. He's also an award-winning, nationally known painter and is locally known as the dean and patriarch of the classical realist artists here in Minnesota and others around the country. He is secretary and co-founder of the American Society of Classical Realism with 40 years professional experience as an artist. Next to Richard is Dr. Barbara Long. She's president of Atelier LAC and has a private psychiatric practice here in Minneapolis. Dr. Long has been an avid supporter and collector of classical realism for many years. And last but not least is Stephen Jertson. He too is a graduate of Atelier LAC in 1974. Stephen has worked as an instructor at Atelier LAC and as a consultant for Atelier Lesueur over the past several years. Stephen has also received several major awards for his work and is known nationwide and has been working professionally as an artist for 15 years. So without further ado, I think we'll get into our opening questions. And throughout the talk that we give tonight, if at any time there's any questions that you may have specifically about any of the subjects we're speaking about, feel free to raise your hand and we'll let you jump in. After we've gone over any discussion that we have in mind, we definitely would be opening up any questions to you on the floor for any questions you might have of the board here or any of the individual artists or members of the panel speaking tonight. Well, to kick things off, I think we need to first address how does classical realism fit into the concepts of postmodern art, and that would include somewhat defining what is postmodern art. It's a term that's being bantered around just recently, and I think it would be good if we kind of address that as a broad general subject first. Dr. Long, would you like to jump right in?
Oh, I don't think so. I'm going to defer to Richard Lack. I think he will make the most eloquent statements you'll hear tonight. So we might as well get the show off to the right start.
It's we've been talking about postmodernism, of course, before this panel get together, and I kind of think of postmodernism as just a word to explain something that hasn't really happened yet. It's as if modernism, probably for the last 75, perhaps even 100 years, has been the dominant element in our in the visual arts, architecture, and so on. And to me, it seems that much of the energy that went into this is kind of running out of steam, and we're at a state now which we call postmodernism, but we're not sure really what that means. Certainly for a painter like myself, I've been called kind of a postmodernist now, and it's kind of ironic for me because I've been painting the way I have for 40 years and have been around that long, working in the same general vein. But I think when you do get a period when tastes are shifting, people start to look for other kinds of art that has been produced or that is being produced to try to get a picture of what is going to happen in the future. So I think postmodernism is, I think it's undefinable right now. We're in a transitionary period. It probably means more of an eclectic period, certainly for the foreseeable future, than we've had in the past.
Okay. Any other comments?
Well, I'll make a comment now. Since I'm a psychiatrist and I deal with psychological phenomena, I don't know if any of you were here to hear my little song and dance a couple of weeks ago, but following on the heels of what Richard Lack said, I have a certain viewpoint which I'll share with you briefly. We've all been aware of the trends of modern art, non-representational art, we would call it, depicting non-representational subjects, objects, and so forth. That has been the predominant theme or mode in our country, certainly since after the close of the Second World War, and in Europe as well. And as Richard said, it's basically running out of steam. If you look at that process from the psychological standpoint, there's a time of death, okay, when life runs out of steam and something dies. And if you look at it from the psychological viewpoint, what happens after that? After death, that's not the end necessarily. There's a resurrection, and we all know that from the biblical sense. There's also a resurrection from the psychological sense. There's a resurrection from the artistic sense. And we've seen that in the history of art from the classical days, and then that being reborn in the Italian Renaissance period, and on in the Baroque Classicist period, and now we're going to have a rebirth of this same kind of tradition, I think, in the 21st century. And that is really what we're trying to help you understand today. That is what we represent, and that's what I believe is on the horizon.
Very good. Well, I think next we would need to address giving or coming up with some definitions for what is classical realism. Lisa?
Oh, we had trouble with this when we were talking about it. It's, as Mr. Lack said, there's a problem with it, that even the term classical realism, because the classical Greeks were really idealists, but they were also people who looked at nature. And I think there are two ways that the people working in this school could be called classical. One is that they are working from a tradition that goes back to the Greeks and came to life again in the Renaissance. And we feel very tied to that particular tradition of working from nature. In another sense, there is a term used in aesthetics and in philosophy where classicism means having to do with timeless, immutable truths. That is, you always go back to the source. And in that sense, you could speak of classicism in the art forms of many countries and many cultures. And that is why Shakespeare is still relevant, because certain things have not changed in the human experience.
What would you say some of those traditions are then? What are some of the specific classical traditions that are being represented and being kept alive then by classical realism?
In general, at least when I opened the atelier, the things I was trying to impart to students and teach, there were really two streams of art that I tried to bring into the program. One, of course, is the American Impressionist, stemming from the Boston School. And this was the strongest living tradition of representational painting, traditional representational painting. And the other is the French Academy, which pretty much died out at the end of the 19th century. That's the weaker of the two streams. My teacher, Gamel, had done a lot of research and had developed some things from the Academy, and his teacher, Paxton, had actually studied with Jerome, a great French academician. But that particular tradition, which is so great in drawing and form, composition, and so on, pretty much had petered out. So what we tried to do is to revitalize it, resurrect it to some degree, and also do a lot of research and experimentation. It's the great school of drawing in the Western European art, and what we've tried to do is to bring that back along with the color that you get in the Impressionist tradition. So that was generally the inheritance
Okay.
that I labeled as classical realism to differentiate it from other kinds of realism. But it's really, as people will say, well, so much of this looks very impressionistic in terms of its color, and which is true. So it's really a hybrid, and we're trying to build on that base, I think, and develop it into the future, widening the scope of subject matter and ideas, perhaps painterly approach and things like that. As the tradition grows, I think you'll see an increasingly wider spectrum of art forms within it.
So do you find that you yourself, you've mastered both styles, the impressionistic style, and use that?
No.
It's always a loaded question.
Sure I have. And a few others as well. No, it's obviously that's these two. When we think of Impressionism, we think of the great, not just the French Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, but we think of the great figures like Vermeer and Velázquez, Chardin, and so on. So that's a pretty tall order. And then the great academic painters, going way back to Raphael, perhaps put in Michelangelo there. So that's pretty tall order to master. But I've been working at it. Let's put it that way.
But you do switch from both styles, and I've
I
noticed
do.
a number of the artists also
Right.
work
Unlike
with both styles.
many painters, even within this tradition, I do attempt to paint in different styles, I guess you could call it, different approaches. As Steve also does that.
The second style. The first style was Impressionism, and then what's the other one?
Well, as I mentioned, it comes really from the academic painters of the 19th century, people like Gérôme, Bouguereau, going back to Ingres, Delaroche. And that's a kind of picture making which attempts, they call it history painting in that period. We like to call it imaginative painting. In other words, the conception comes from not necessarily the visible world, but from imagination. It could be fantasy, symbol, literature, whatever the case may be. There's nothing here that would represent that in the exhibition that would represent that aspect. So, in a sense, it is somewhat incomplete. It isn't storytelling, picture making necessarily, but it could be, and that it requires a different process of painting.
Or symbolism.
It could be symbolism. I'm working on some large paintings now, which are completely symbolic, rather very personal. So, but it is a different kind of picture making.
What is the difference? Why don't you explain the difference?
Well, that gets quite complicated. But if you think of it this way, that if you are inspired by the visible world, now that would be landscapes, nature, somebody's a portrait, a beautiful head, perhaps still life. All these things that we see in our everyday world, that would come under the heading of a kind of impressionist art, that you're putting down what you see. And usually this kind of painting, you're painting directly from the subject. If I did a series of landscapes in Colorado just a month or a couple months ago, and I would go out to the subject, look for the composition, set up, and actually paint it on the spot.
Certain time of day,
Certain time of day, exactly. And almost everything, sweeping my eye around here, I would say almost everything here would be done by the artist in front of nature. He or she might make compositional sketches or whatever, but it would be painted directly in front of nature. Now, the other kind of painting would be something that you would draw from imagination. Now, in the history of Western art, obviously the two main streams would be religious painting, taken primarily from biblical texts, Old and New Testament, and then mythology. As you know, Renaissance painting dwells a lot on ancient Greek and Roman mythology. They drew their subject matter from that. It was wonderful kinds of stories. Ovid's Metamorphosis, there was dragons and people fighting dragons and conflict, and you could use the nude, and there was just all the wonderful pictorial themes for the painter. So that would be a picture that would have to be done, started with an imaginative concept, and then you've got to go to nature and find pieces of nature, so to speak, piece of drapery here, figure drawing there, whatever, and take these pieces and put it together in your studio to create an imaginary world. You obviously can't set that up in front of you and just, let's say, St. George slaying the dragon. You can't obviously bring in a St. George and a dragon and set it up in your studio. You'd have to reconstruct it using imagination and whatever devices you use. So it's an entirely different form of picture making.
Are they both expressions of realism then?
Yeah, in this case, yes.
I think one of the keys to remember is that, especially in the past, even in what we'd call today imaginative painting, they based everything on a very clear and accurate representation of nature, even though they felt free to change for the sake of their own expression. And to tie this in with kind of the idea of postmodernism, what I see when I look at some of the work that's being done now called postmodernism, that has taken on the term classical realism. I mean, Mr. Lack coined the term a few years ago, and it's kind of caught on to describe this whole phenomenon. And what I see, in fact, I just saw a picture the other day, is that the artists feel free now to borrow anything from the past. It's open season to borrow anything from the past. It used to be, 20 years ago, you just didn't borrow anything back
You'd be
further than the
derivative.
19th century.
Right.
You couldn't go back there. It was like you were labeled all kinds of awful names if you did that. But now, at least there's the freedom amongst the younger artists to go back to find something that gives them meaning in their life and in their art. And what they're doing is they're going back to the older painters, and they're borrowing things from these older painters. But what I see in the work that's being done by the artists is they're not imbibing the spirit of the painters of the past. They're making pastiches after the painters of the past, and they're borrowing pieces of paintings that were done by painters of the past. They're taking Greek statues, and they're incorporating Greek statues into their work. Therefore, it becomes classical realism. Aren't they borrowing from the Greeks? Or they take Roman statues, or they take themes that were done in the past, or they take figures that were done by Titian, or Tintoretto, or Rubens, or something, and they include those gestures or those figures in their pictures. And sometimes very badly rendered, much poorly done, obviously, than Titian or Tintoretto did. I saw a painting the other day that cribbed two figures from a painting by Tintoretto. And, he was saying that I'm a postmodernist, so I can do that now, but they were really poorly cribbed figures. It wasn't anything like the things that they were actually copying. And what they're doing is they're taking all those things, but they're not imbibing that spirit, and that spirit is the thing that gave those things the life and the freshness. What we're trying to do is not go back and pastiche these things. We're trying to go back to the source of inspiration that moved those people to do those works in the first place. And that is basically a spiritual phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon, and the phenomenon of being excited about what you see. You have two things going. You have the intellectual element, the conceptual element, and then you have the visual element that the artist has always dealt with. And we are much firmly, hopefully, rooted in the aspect of looking at something from nature and rendering it. What I see in these other works is they go back to classical themes. They even go back to classical modes of composition borrowed from certain painters like Claude Lorrain or Poussin or something. But they don't know how to look at nature. They either copy photographs or slides, or they paint strictly out of their head. And it has none of that spirit, that intense spirit that imbibes these older painters. And when they went out and they looked at something, even if they didn't paint directly from life. Maybe they did it from studies, or maybe they did it from drawings, but they had in their head that love of nature. It just seeped in there. And when you look at their paintings, you're convinced that it's right. I mean, it may not be right from an impressionist standpoint in terms of going out and saying, well, I know that isn't right because I've seen that effect and I've studied it and I've tried to get the color. But in terms of form and the fact that it's convincing, you're just convinced that that world is just the way it should be. And some of the things that I see today, you're not convinced that that's the way it should be. It looks phony.
Well, that's an excellent point, and as many of you have seen in the back of the exhibition area, there are student drawings and paintings from the figure, from the nude, which is the basis of our Western art, and that's one of the reasons for this, I think, is the breakdown, the training. This is what we've talked about a great deal, that this tradition broke down because the master-pupil relationship, which went into it for centuries, fell apart towards the beginning of the century. And so I know what you're talking about. I see a kind of naive attempt on the part of particularly younger artists to connect to history, which is a sincere motivation on their part, but without connecting to a tradition, they're kind of leaping over this the necessity of studying nature because they don't have a tradition to work into. If you look at the life drawing in the art schools around the country now, they're dreadful. They're just bad, and it's simply not taught anymore. And so naturally, again, the inspiration for this is very sincere. They want to reconnect to nature, to history, but they don't quite know how to do it. So they come up with kind of some strange results, and I think they're doing it often with great sincerity, but simply out of naivety and lack of knowledge.
The Atelier Lac, which is the school that Richard founded 20 years ago in 1990. By the way, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Don't forget, I want to say something about that later, but I want to follow up on what Steve and Richard have just said to tell you that in training an artist, it's like training to do anything very, very well, whether you're going to be a surgeon or a psychiatrist or a commercial artist,
Or a basketball player.
or a basketball player, or an artist. You start at the beginning. I mean, our students go through 4 years at least of very rigorous master-student, hard, grueling work where they start off from the very beginning in black and white with charcoal and casts of Greek busts, etc. Why? Because they're trying to learn to draw properly. There is a real discipline to learning to draw. And if you don't believe me, sit down and try and draw your whatever, mother, father, significant other, and see how much it looks like that person. It takes a tremendous amount of time just to learn to draw. But then if you're also going to train yourself to look at a subject so that you can transfer that three-dimensional person onto a two-dimensional canvas, the way, for instance, Lisa has beautifully done that portrait I want to point out to you. Now that is an example of what we're trying to tell you about here is authenticity. That the composition is beautiful, the rendering of the person is beautiful, the light is just fantastic. That is Rembrandt-esque light. If you've never seen a real Rembrandt in a museum, that's the closest thing in this room that you'll see.
Rembrandt is rolling over in his grave.
Well, it is. And I know. I've seen them in my hands.
He's going to come through that door
But
with his paintbrushes like
the point is, there's no plagiarism there. When you look at that painting, anyone can look at that and say, obviously, whoever painted that, that's a very good painting. Actually, it's a very good painting from any perspective that you would like to view it, whether you're viewing it from the eye of a collector and saying that is going to be worth quite a lot of money someday if you want to look at the shadow side, the money side here, or if you want to look at that just from the point of view of the historical, the legacy that we're talking about, from the point of view of the artist looking at that, a professional artist who knows what our tradition is about, will look at that and say it's a very good painting. Or just from the human standpoint, if you look at that, it's a beautiful piece of art. And so all of that falls into place when you see authentic painting. You know it's right. Another example is Don Kessner's painting over here, just over Lisa's shoulder. That is a beautiful piece of work. Look at the shadows on the snow. Look at the soft light coming through, filtering through the clouds. It's just a beautiful piece of work. The composition is nice, the color is nice.
And it has a lot of feeling.
It has a lot of feeling, a lot of, that's the other thing we haven't said, but we'll just say it. Very good art is an expression of the soul of the painter. That's why it's not a photograph. You're seeing the soul of the painter. So any of these wonderful paintings that you see here, the still lifes, the landscapes, there's another wonderful portrait behind you in the back there. Now that's a wonderful Vermeer-esque painting. Beautiful interior, the composition is nice, the rendering of the person is lovely, the color is nice, and it's also an expression of the artist, how the artist saw that woman in that setting at that time, capturing a mood, the mood that she expresses very well looking out of the window. So just to follow up a little bit on what Richard and Steve have said, that's part of what we're trying to tell you a little bit about
Now, you
tonight.
said these paintings are very good, but you didn't say they're great, though. In what way are they short of being great?
Probably about 100 years.
Well put.
No, I think you're not going to get great paintings until you have a tremendous, a lot of people being trained and years of generations being trained. And I mean, we're working in a vacuum. We're working with no understanding and very little appreciation. And you can't. In the 19th century, they were training tens of thousands of. I don't know how many. I mean, every year they were training thousands of painters.
Well, I can't
Probably
No,
not
but
quite
the-
that many, but
The real answer, though, is that I've lived in Minnesota too long. I heard a wonderful speech on public radio today about the great Minnesota expression, "It's pretty good." Did anyone hear that? It's a unique Minnesota expression. It's pretty good. Everything is pretty good. And somebody said, why don't you say something is wonderful? And the answer is that Minnesotans have mastered the art of understatement. And so it's
No,
good.
but seriously though, it takes time. I mean, it takes
Years.
time to build anything. And this is, this is a very young.
well, I would also kind of disagree with that. I think I think the best of the work produced here and among the other so-called classical realists around the country in the last 30 years or so, the best of it now weeded out, and that's what in any period holds up reasonably well. Granted, there isn't that stunning array of genius that you had in the Renaissance or in certain times in Holland, for example. But I think the work, I think some of the work is really outstanding and would hold its own with the best in American painting. So I think we have a tendency, as kind of the older member of this, I think we have a tendency to kind of run things down. But sometimes I'm rather astonished at the level that is being achieved. And you say great, that's always a judgment of history. You can't, within your own time, say that this is great or whatever, or that the ultimate. It takes time, in a sense, to weed things out. I know of no period in history where people would make that final judgment. It does take history to weed things out.
Well, I'm not saying these paintings are great myself. I'm just asking her.
Sure.
I can add something. Just a subjective thought. I was in Washington a couple of years ago for a classical realist conference, and my wife and I visited probably one of the greatest museums in the world. That's the National Gallery. I mean, it's filled with masterpieces. They have good pictures by all the great painters. And I made a comment to my wife when we were leaving that the best pictures in all the genres that were represented there that we do, that people within our tradition do, would hold up on those walls. The best portraits of Richard Lack would hold up in a room of Rembrandt's. Now you go, oh my God. And he might say no, but I'm telling you that the qualities that are there, those timeless qualities, the qualities of workmanship and drawing and all those things, composition, that his portraits would not be out of place in that museum. There are landscapes, good landscapes, that would not be out of place in the Impressionist section of that museum. There are imaginative pictures that would not be out of place in there, and people would go through there and they probably look for the name and expect that person to have been dead for 200 years. And they'd look and then it would say American Contemporary, 19-something, and then no date for the death, and they would probably, the average
Not
person
yet.
would be amazed. They'd go, gee, I didn't know people were still doing that kind of work. And the sad thing is that
That's what they say, though,
for,
too.
for 200 years, we won't see any of our work in a museum, and we won't get into that topic, but just on the subject of them being good enough, I think there's plenty of high-quality work being done by the people today.
I
It may
think-
not be great, but it's right up.
Well, I think one thing too, it's an emerging tradition. Certainly the Minnesota artists, I guess, opening the atelier 20 years ago, and of course my colleague Don Kestner and I have been here for a good 35, almost 40 years. That, was building this tradition. So what I see, trying to look at it objectively, is a lot of fine picture making and potential too. I mean, good picture making. And these things that come through later in the tradition, the personality, more striking originality, grasping with say, more contemporary concepts. By contemporary, I mean things that don't necessarily have to lean on conceptions that were done in the past. That's something that's going to be coming. And that's going to take time. But I think starting with the good picture making at this stage, come back in 20 years, and you'll see a lot of these hallmarks that make masterpieces, namely the personality and originality, et cetera, based on good picture making. That hopefully will start to take place, and I see it as the younger painters start to mature. So it's getting there.
It takes time.
Yeah,
We don't. America is, we've got a overnight trends. In the arts, you build traditions very, very slowly. Even the high Renaissance took. Michelangelo just didn't come out of the studio. There's 200 years of going back to Giotto and before Cimabue that were behind the high. So in any kind of great tradition in art, there are many people contributing to it, and you just don't do it in one generation. It takes a long time, and we don't really understand that in this country. That's why we have a tendency to cut off traditions, and we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Modernism, when it hit America, was an interesting innovation, had to be developed. But what it did, it's also cut off the American traditions of representational art and cut its connections to Europe in that regard. So that was not unnecessary. So it's a rebuilding stage that we as traditional representational painters are doing right now. And I think there are a lot of, as I agree with you, a lot of high-level achievement, but it's still in the building stage. People have to remember that. We're
Well, I
not
think
there
with
yet.
the topics that you've brought up, there's one kind of centralizing theme, and that's that there's been a change. There's been a change. There was a change quite a long time ago in the way artists were trained compared to what's going on in your atelier and what's going on in Annette's and other training locations that are trying to revitalize this tradition. And I think it would be good to maybe address that briefly as to what are some of those differences in the way that the artists are being trained, and how did that change? What suddenly changed the way artists and painters were being trained?
First of all, the shift took place. People think, well, this is something that's fairly recent, like say the 30s or right after the war. This is not true. The real shift took place, I would say, in the last decade of the 19th century. Prior to that, painters had been trained in the apprentice system or studio system, or even in the academies in Europe. Most of the great American painters, one way or the other, had gone to Europe, taken part in their traditions, their training, and then had brought that back. And we tried to establish some schools, the Boston School, Pennsylvania Academy, and all that. But they were still kind of leaning on the European experience. But what happened, take the drawing for example, the serious study of drawing, which at the very least takes about 4 years of studying the nude, broke down. and there was no longer the serious engagement of trying to draw from nature, draw the nude from nature. I was in New York, I think it was it was a year and a half ago. There was a show at the National Academy, life drawings from the Academy School there, that went back to before World War I, the 20s, and the 30s. Now, the things that were done before World War I were fairly decent. They probably weren't on the highest level, the life drawings, highest level of, say, work done in the Paris ateliers in 1890s, 80s. But you hit 1930, and it was unbelievable. They had them in chronological order. The deterioration of the studies, young students, 21, 22, 18, 19, whatever, the drawing had gone down like that. By the time you hit 1940, 1950, 1960, forget it. The drawing was just plain bad. It wasn't studied, and it was just bad. Yeah.
Why was that then? Obviously not the level of talent of the students.
No.
but the
No, it was the
then.
training.
It was a training. And also, the innovations of modernism were so exciting that the great modern masters, Matisse and Picasso, let's face it, they really were not draftsmen in that traditional sense. So students coming along in the 30s is very exciting, it's avant-garde and wow. And we don't really have to spend all this time learning to draw because Picasso never mastered that tradition, neither did Matisse. So we can just go shooting along, and we'll kind of skip that part, and we'll go in and I can't speak for modern painting. Maybe this kind of drawing is a hindrance. I don't know. I mean, that's not for me to say. But I do know for certain kinds of traditional picture making, you've got to go through that hard-boiled stage of learning to draw. And I think, to answer your question, I think it was both the breakdown of the training system and also a certain psychology among youth that they could skip all these things. This was characteristic of our culture in general, that you can just take shortcuts until we reached the post-war period, post-World War II period, when it was do your own thing. And now we're in a crisis. I think everybody in this country realized that we're in an educational crisis. When people are graduating from college maybe and can't read or write, but certainly from high schools, and we've seen what's happening around the rest of the world, that we've just lost the rigor of education, and that's certainly been true in traditional art.
I can just speak from a student's viewpoint. If when I was a student going to several art schools in various universities and some private art schools, I couldn't find the training. And I would ask my teachers to help me, and there wasn't a teacher who did. In fact, I would even give them the charcoal and say, please, can you show me how to do this? And they would not pick the charcoal up. And I think if to say that you don't need to learn to draw, I think is a very valid point if you're doing a certain kind of painting, and I have no trouble with that. That's fine. But what I usually found was that there's an assumption that, well, we've all mastered that, and
Gone beyond it.
yeah, and then when you'd say to them, look, I really am having trouble, and for some peculiar reason, I do want to try to draw this person. And I don't want it to look like someone else. I really want it to be them. I want to understand their face for my own bizarre reasons, and I can't do it. Could you help me? There was nothing. And that's when I began to wonder if they could do it. And I don't have any trouble. If you say you don't need to do it, that's fine. I'm willing to buy that. But what bothers me is the notion that somehow that they can get away with saying, we can do it, but I'm never going to show you that I can do it. And it got to the point in one class, in fact, where I finally set up a drape study in the corner and was trying to paint it, and this teacher walked by me every class and didn't say a word to me. And I was a non-person in that class, and all the students noticed it, and they were coming up to me going, geez, he hasn't taught till quarter. And I said, yeah, I guess he's not going to, and he didn't. So I think that it doesn't take long. It only takes one generation to lose training. All you have to have is the students saying, we don't want to learn this, and people forget that. It doesn't take that long to lose that. And if you haven't been trained, you can't. You just can't do it. You think you can, and I thought a lot of things before I started studying. And it's only when you finally realize how bad the drawings are, and that you can begin to learn, because it really is getting rid of a lot of preconceptions about form and misconceptions, and learning all over again like a child. That's exactly what it's like. It's very humiliating, but it's also very exciting. And it's different. It's quite different. You have to kind of go through it to know what it's like. Some of you are going through it right now.
There's a danger with this too, and that is that definitions of things go through a change. And to justify certain things, people will begin changing the definitions of a certain thing. When I went to art school, I met with the same problem that Lisa did, and I speak for just about everybody I've trained at the atelier. And that is, you know, one of my art teachers told me, he said the two greatest draftsmen in the world were Ingres and Matisse, you know. And I said, I don't want to draw like Matisse, I want to draw like Ingres. And he said, there's no difference. They're both the same. They're equal. And a lot of the students went, ooh, that's wonderful. You mean I can just go like this, and that's just as good as Ingres and Michelangelo and Raphael and all these type of people? And yes, that's right. They are equally as good. When you broaden the definition out to say, if you put pencil to paper, and that's drawing, and one thing is just as good as another thing, then what you've done is you've destroyed all hope for coming to any kind of a consensus of what is good or bad, right or wrong, mediocre, and all this type of thing. And that's what they've done. They've succeeded in destroying the definition of things. And so we don't have a leg to stand on when we talk to them on an intellectual level or an artistic level. We can, you know, explain to them what we're doing, but what has happened is they have another definition for drawing in reality, and there is another definition of drawing that we're going by. We're not judging our drawing by what Matisse did. We're judging our drawing by a whole different set of criteria. They can go off and do what they want, but we're not trying to do that. We're trying to go by a different definition. But to the public at large and to the students, it makes a big difference when those definitions are destroyed, because they're totally confused. It also makes art real easy. And if art is really easy and it's anything that anybody wants to do, then you're going to get just what we have in the second half of the 20th century, and you take it or leave it. You can't argue with them. You can't say anything about it. It's just take it or leave it.
Well, yeah, and to me, the tragedy of the last 100 years of painting has been the fact that, first of all, the innovations of modernism may be great, may be wonderful. Many things I do enjoy, many things I do not. But to make the whole stream of Western art be squeezed into modernism was a mistake. In other words, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater at the turn of the century. And we lost a lot of potential creativity by so doing. Always in a revolutionary period, people throw everything out that they and with it they throw out the good things. And I think if the parallel stream of traditional Western art coming from the Renaissance had been kept alive along with the parallel development of modernism, we would have had a much richer and a much more interesting visual aesthetic in our epoch, our period, than we have now. And the proof of that is that so much of modernism is proving to be shallow. It's running out. It was in a sense built on some assumptions which were cooked up by critics who were actually not part of the painting scene. One of the assumptions, for example, is that Picasso had mastered the great Western tradition. He did not. Now, you can say Picasso is the greatest creative figure that ever lived, fine, but you cannot say that he had mastered this particular tradition, because there's nothing in his work to indicate that. So then, but the assumption is that he, by mastering this tradition, drawing like Raphael when he was 3 months old or whatever, had made the logical transition to modernism. But you can't throw something out that you don't possess. So when Picasso did all his innovations and experimentations, he was not throwing out Western art because he had never possessed it in his own work. But the critics, by blowing up and making comparisons, as Steve points out, between the draftsmanship of Matisse and Ingres, there just isn't any comparison. Anybody with eyes can see that. Now, Matisse, again, may be great. I'm not going to argue that, but you're comparing apples and oranges. So that crucial artistic and intellectual shift that was made in the 90s, 1890s, 1900, which created the stream of modernism, was based to some degree, to a large degree, on some false premises. Now we're reaping the conclusion, the result of that in the situation that we're in. I think there's a great deal of crisis in avant-gardism today. People just don't know where they're going and so on, because it's just run itself out.
And I think part of the reason why this was successful in the earlier part of this century, for instance, is that in our educational systems, art was not taught, or only taught when you got to college, if you were lucky. It's certainly not required. So the vast majority of people coming out of high schools, much less universities or colleges, really knew nothing about art. Nothing. So all of this sort of hogwash, if you'll excuse me, is my viewpoint, could come along with no questioning and no criticism from our people. If someone said, oh, Picasso really did master draftsmanship, nobody questioned, because nobody knew. So what we're doing, a part of what we're doing right here with you now, and what we're doing on and on, is we're trying to help re-educate people about what their heritage is in Western civilization, in art of Western civilization, and why what we're doing here isn't, well, not what I'm doing, what these three artists and what Gary in his organization is doing. Why that's so important is because we're so close. We're just a hair close to losing it in our whole civilization. And these people sitting here, these artists sitting here, that's the thread that we're holding on to in our civilization, in this tradition. And if we lose it, we've lost it all the way back to the Greeks and back before that. But we have to help people understand the context of Western art, and when we talk about what is high-quality art, what are the standards for form, composition, etc., what makes a picture good, we're trying to help people understand that the standards by which Steve is discussing what's good, what's not so good, Mr. Lack discusses what's good and what's not so good. What are they talking about? They're going back to standards that started in the Greek period, up through the Italian Renaissance and beyond that, in these isolated periods of time. It's standards that emerged from all of that have continued, that have been reborn, recast in subsequent centuries. And that's what we're trying to preserve now.
I might add to that, too, that not to get back to the controversy between modernism versus tradition, but what I would personally like to see is obviously the continuation of the modern tradition, and it is a tradition that's 100 years old now, and continue to work on innovations, experimentations, etc. Parallel traditions being strengthened by more public and certainly critical and museum acceptance of, the things that we're doing, the classical realists, if you want to, if that's the word that covers this whole thing, and possibly the coming together of certain things that could be mutually beneficial. There are a lot of ideas in modernism which I am fascinated by. I just don't feel that the forms that have been used are universal enough. That's my personal opinion. But certainly the ideas and the aims are there. So by no means do we want to seem reactionary. We are not. But to have a healthy, broadened culture, I think these two things should be brought along together. And I think the time now is the recognition of where modernism came from, how it developed, and also to understand that there is this other parallel tradition that is coming. And that's what postmodernism is all about, in my opinion. It's, at least in terms of painting, it's an awakening to the diversity that's and the potential that is now taking place. The crisis in avant-gardism, avant-garde painting, is simply a symptom of things running out, and the emergence of classical realism is also a symptom of how things are shifting, and out of that, who knows what will happen in the next century. And art is very long. It's not done overnight.
Well, we're almost running out of time here. Yes?
Vanessa, I know that you place a lot of emphasis on the old traditions, the methods of drawing and painting. For your students, do you emphasize also study of history, of mythology?
I try to,
Images,
and they,
you know,
yeah,
it's an image.
sure.
And it has all these emotional connotations, just not a Venus, you have to know.
Right,
Right,
the context and the
context,
history.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, we try to, the unfortunate thing, just thinking of my personal experience as a teacher, it's so difficult to train the eye and to train these, these basic skills in picture making that a lot of this does get lost. I mean, I think all atelier students should work all day long in the atelier, and they should go to the university studying psychology and mythology and history and literature and music and all these things. But we can't do that in the atelier as much as I would like to. But
And studying, the other cultures too.
Yeah, and studying other cultures,
But particularly
exactly.
Art of the Orient has been,
Right.
I personally studied literature. Professionally, I work as a nurse, I need bread and butter, but I studied literature, and if I'm in a personal pain or crisis, certain images come to mind. If I'm really angry, Medea comes to mind.
Sure.
But yeah, apparently grade
Kids on the
school
stage,
children are
and
no longer being taught mythology. That's what I heard
now
recently.
learning to draw,
Yeah,
I could draw.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
Do you see a hope for the art audience, like there's a handful of us people here, as far as the educational system is concerned? When I went to school, I had to take 3 years of music appreciation and a couple of years of art appreciation, training the eye and so on. Not for the purpose of becoming an artist or a painter, but just so when I got out living, I was trained to appreciate beauty or my ear. Do you see that in grade school or high schools, or do you see, you're painters up there and you're trying to sell your works, make a living right now? And obviously, your life is one of beauty, and your art is your life. Okay?
Right.
And you see you people getting into the educational system,
You better believe it.
Channel 2, I don't know what I'm talking about right now, but do you see yourself coming up with something?
If I may answer that, I would say that's more the role of what the American Society of Classical Realism would like to accomplish, and why we've banded together and we're organizing it, and we're getting the artists involved in it. There's a guild forming for the artists, and we're encouraging non-artists to become members that are interested in helping us to support this art form. And some of the programs that we have envisioned would be to get into the educational system, to have seminars to educators and to the various schools, to get on to Channel 2 with ideally someday a regular program on the arts. So those are some of the things that we would like to accomplish. And any of you here that would like to help us in that cause, my first request would be to become a member of the society. And we have various levels of membership that we offer at various price ranges that are very modest to very generous. And so anywhere between there from the top to the bottom, anything that you can do would be very helpful, to help us financially just get the ball rolling, as well as in your own personal involvement at some point. So we encourage that very much. Yes, sir.
I guess the final question would be, are the 3 artists on the panel making a living at their art?
Barely.
No, I'm doing
I know
reasonably
He's
well.
doing well.
That's directed at Stephen Jerks.
Are there any other questions before we just wrap up here?
Could we say something about the 1990?
Yes, there is one last thing, though, that I would like to, I think, to kind of bring this full circle before we make some announcements, is there was a conversation I had with Richard. I don't know if you'll recall this, maybe I'll jar your memory, early on when I first met you. And we're talking about the role of the artists in society and the role of the artists in culture. And I was making the observation that I thought that looking in the past and throughout history, the role of the artist held a very lofty position in the culture and in the society, and it represented the society's ideals and the dreams and the goals and the aspirations of what was beautiful and what was possible and what was the best that man could hope to accomplish. And that had changed, and you made a very interesting remark. Do you remember what you said about what you thought the role of the artist had become?
No, you'll have to remind me about that.
You mentioned that it turned in on itself and became a mirror. and was throwing back at society what society was throwing out at itself with the turmoil that was going on through the 2 world wars, the change in the Industrial Revolution. There's been a lot that's going on within our culture and within society itself, and that the artists at that time fulfilled a very possible needed role of holding a mirror up to society itself and showing society some of the demons and some of the worst that society had to offer, to deal with it, to bring it out and to deal with it. And we're reaching a point where that's beginning to become accomplished. And I'm definitely very much an optimist. And I see that that is being accomplished in the world today. I don't know how many of you saw the news before you came over today, but the Berlin Wall is practically down. It's only up as a wall currently, and people are now allowed to travel over the German border as of today anytime they want, with no restrictions. And there'll be free elections in East Germany probably within the year. And that's phenomenal. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. I really didn't. I'm sure all of you feel the same way. I take that, and we could rattle on all night about the different things that are occurring in the world today that I think are very, very positive. And that now the role of the artist is to, once again, hold up to mankind and to the world all that it possibly can be, the ideals and the beauty. It's time for us to go back to the values that we've all believed in, of truth and honesty and beauty and humanity and the spirit of man, the spirit of God, and the spirit that's ourselves, and that this work can represent. Reach out for the best that you can be, because it all is possible.
Can I say one quick word
Sure.
on that? You mentioned what I was talking about. I think we're living in a rapidly accelerating change. I mean, the zeitgeist now is such that no one can keep up with it. Then this is why we talk about postmodernism, that people sense what was in the past 100 years, let's say, the trial and turmoil of the 20th century. This is somewhat behind us. We're opening up to a new world, but we don't know what it is. And and this goes through generation. The new generations in Eastern Europe. My wife is Hungarian, keeps contact with what's going on there. This is all. There's something generating which is working so rapidly, a ferment, and the crisis of the modern world, which we all can talk about, the ecology, et cetera, we all know, the bomb. That is also, in a sense, accelerating. So the whole shift of everything is like a huge, great, big mixing bowl, and it's being moved around. And I think what Gary said about these older values which supported Western painting, that too has to be in the mix. I don't know, I'm not perhaps as much an optimist as Gary, but I know that the things that he was talking about, some people have to represent that and stand for that, if for no other reason than to say that's there. So living people are doing this sort of thing. The whole 40 years of avant-gardism has been despair and darkness and ugliness. Okay, fine, that's one side. But there's also the other thing, and I suppose by temperament, the three of us and the people involved in classical realism feel that this is important as well. And I think the general mass of the public are starting to feel that too in this age of turmoil and shift and change. And I think that's postmodernism.
Very good. Thank you very much to the panel. Dr. Long wanted to make a brief announcement about...
I'm waiting all night.
Yes.
In 1990, the Atelier Lac celebrates its 20th anniversary. And as a part of that, we have found our musical counterpart. Actually, we've known him for about how many years? 6 years? 5 or 6 years now. He's a Metropolitan Opera tenor. And he's the youngest person ever to have won the Metropolitan auditions. And he is a friend of the Atelier Lac, and he's coming with his accompanist on May 18th, 1990, to give us a benefit concert here. Everybody, put your name down and address. We'll send you an invitation.